DevilNeverCry.
What is up everyone, it is me DevilNeverCry, and in today's video I'll be reviewing Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster, or Dead Rising Remake as it's colloquially known as. A big thank you to Capcom for providing me with a copy for review purposes, and the footage that you're seeing in the background was all captured from a PS5. As always, thank you for your continued support, and if you want to see more reviews then do be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing. The Dead Rising series is one that I barely dabbled in, especially considering the initial game that dropped back in 2006 was an Xbox 360 exclusive, and of course I grew up in a household with a PS3. Even when the games began to hit other platforms, I always told myself it was a series that I eventually would get into, and thanks to the Deluxe Remaster that we have here, it was finally my chance. Dead Rising puts you in the shoes of Frank West, a photojournalist who currently is pursuing a huge lead, the scoop of a lifetime you could say. Initially thinking that the incident that he was investigating was a riot, he inevitably finds himself in a small town that is completely overrun by the undead. As is often the case when calamities ensue, the worst of the worst happens and he finds himself trapped in a local shopping mall. But even in this precarious situation, there is a light at the end of a tunnel. Rescue has been promised within 3 days, and all he has to do essentially is hold out until then. And so, Frank begins to set out to uncover what exactly caused this outbreak and potentially how could it be avoided elsewhere. And that 3-day time limit, truncated into mere hours for this game, is the entire framework of the game, where everything you do is essentially time sensitive. Your main goal is to follow up a series of scoops or leads in the game to uncover the mystery of the outbreak. You're also tasked with saving survivors who are scattered all around the mall, and of course, fighting off numerous psychopaths who are basically hell-bent on wreaking as much havoc as possible. Of course, all of this while navigating through a shopping mall that is densely packed with zombies. Most of this should seem quite familiar and isn't necessarily all too much of a challenge, but the time limit that is attached with everything that you do in the game really begins to amp up the pressure. And I think the beauty of the game is the fact that it offers you a lot of choice. If you want to, you don't even have to engage with the game. You could simply wait out that 3-day limit, albeit you'll end up knowing completely nothing. You could decide to just beeline the main story, every man for himself, and just not bother to save any possible survivors. And of course, you can try and avoid as many psychopaths as possible to keep yourself alive. But you'd pretty much miss out on all of the gameplay the game has to offer. Dead Rising plays as a straightforward, third-person action-adventure game, largely set entirely in the mall itself that has been cordoned off into several different zones. A holdover from the original game that they decided not to change for this remake. Initially, Frank feels quite cumbersome to control. He's got no abilities whatsoever, he doesn't move very fast, and he doesn't hit very hard at all. But by collecting experience points, or PP as the game calls it, through saving people, snapping pictures with your camera, or killing psychos, you begin to level up, and overall this makes Frank faster, stronger, tougher, and gives him a whole suite of moves that he can use when dispatching the undead. Which on the one hand is great, because the more you play and the more time passes, the more Frank begins to feel like an experienced survivor. I will say though that the skills and melee moves you gain access to are completely useless when it comes to dealing with hordes of undead, but at least they offer some variety in that sense. There is a large emphasis on melee combat in the game, with pretty much anything and everything in the mall itself being capable as being wielded as a weapon. And whacking undead with whatever you can get your hands on definitely feels crunchy and cathartic, which I think is definitely a plus. However, I will say that everything in general still feels a little bit stiff. Attacks don't necessarily flow quite well. Guns are okay for the most part, they're typically better for dealing with the living, or psychos in this instance. But Frank definitely controls like he's a character from a 2006 game. All of this combines for a rather straightforward playing experience, but as I've mentioned, that real challenge comes from the time limit. I find myself going through a lot more riskier routes, wading through hordes of zombies, just to try and make sure I got to a survivor or one of my goals on time. And of course, eventually shortcuts that you learn do make things a whole lot smoother, but even still, things like rescuing survivors can be rather tricky or cumbersome at times, particularly those that are like slow, timid, or just literally need to be carried to safety. That is often easier said than done when you have to take them from one side of the mall all the way to the other, across droves of undead, whilst also keeping them alive. The psychopaths that populate the mall are technically this game's version of bosses. They're all wildly different in both how they act, how they fight, and the whole narrative structure surrounding them, they're pretty much just absurd caricatures, which is entirely okay, but just don't expect any compelling characters or moving scenes to really set the stage. And overall, despite being bosses, they're not really all that hard to deal with, provided you go into the fight with decent weapons. By the time that I got to the end of the third day, I'd followed up on all of the cases that I had at my disposal, and this led me to an ending of sorts. However, the game actually unlocked an overtime mode, which added an additional day into the mix, and it came with its own tasks and goals. Think of this as the game's true ending, so to speak. Overall, with several deaths and a few restarts, I finally got to the end of the game within a 10-hour span, but of course beating overtime mode also unlocked infinity mode. An additional mode that, unlike overtime, was rather light on the narrative and purely tasked you with surviving as long as possible, whilst also procuring items like food to make sure that you live. Having heard all of that, you might consider the game to be rather light on content, particularly with its somewhat short runtime. But the beauty of the game, of course, is the replayability, and the fact that there are several challenges for you to aim for. The game does provide a unique feature in that you can start a new game plus whenever you want, regardless of where you are in the game, where you're allowed to retain Frank's stats, allowing you to play from the beginning, albeit this time with new knowledge of what to expect. That replayability, though, does depend on how much you enjoyed your initial playthrough. If I had to give my final verdict, I did really enjoy Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster, especially coming from somebody who's barely dabbled in the series itself. The cheesy B-movie feel to its narrative and the absurdity of what the game expects you to do, particularly in this framework, I really liked, and I also enjoyed the arcadey feel to it in how the game is designed and how essentially you're pushed to accomplish your goals within the game. It very much feels like a game from 2006 with just a bunch of quality of life changes made to it to bring it up to contemporary standards, and for me, it worked out great. I'm currently in the process of getting the Platinum Trophy, and all I can say is if you like what you see of the game, then I would definitely recommend that you check it out, especially if it's a series that you've not dabbled in before. Just be aware that some of the early 2000s jank still permeates in its game design. And of course, if you're already a fan of Dead Rising, then I can imagine this game's already on your radar, and I'm pretty much just preaching to the choir at this point. And with that, we come to the end of the video. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, whether you're somebody who's played the Dead Rising series before, or you're a newcomer, and what your thoughts are on this Deluxe Remaster. If you enjoyed today's video, do be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing for more game reviews. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.